Today we are going to look at three cantos. They are connected in a number of interesting ways, cantos 9, 10, and 11. They describe, they focus on the pilgrims and the guide, Virgil, being approaching the city of Dis. So we are moving, they are moving, and we with them, away from the area of incontinence, which is the section of Inferno we read through from Canto 5 to Canto 8. They're approaching with the gates of the city of Dis in Canto 9, and the pilgrim experiences a serious impediment, an impasse, we would call it. He cannot go any further. The guidance of Virgil fails him. And we are going to examine why it fails him and what is the problem that the pilgrim will have to solve. Once he is in Canto, within the city of Dis, the first sinners he meets are the so-called heretics, heresiarchs, chief among whom is really Epicurus. So they're the Epicureans. And in many ways, you understand already the link between the city and these philosophers. Let me just add one thing, so you have the ideas a bit clear. Dante acknowledges in this philosophical text that he writes called The Banquet, three schools of philosophy. The so-called academics or Aristotelians, then the Stoics, and third, the Epicureans. Now he just examines who these Epicureans are, and for him they appear as those who are guilty of some form of pride, if you wish, intellectual pride, since heresy is a question of intellect and not of will. We'll talk about that. They deny the immortality of the soul. And in fact, it's really a problem to figure out why should Dante think of them as sinners at all. In antiquity, they were viewed as one more school of opinion, of philosophical opinion. My mind does not convince me, my reason does not find it convincing, the belief in the immortality of the soul. Why should I be punished? It's an intellectual, since the logic of Dante's own idea of sinfulness is that the will has to be involved. The will is at the center of the habit to sin. Well, we'll talk about this. Then in Canto 11, there really is no great action. Dante goes on explaining the so-called topography of evil, goes on explaining the arrangement of sins. What is the principle? What is the principle of construction of the Inferno? And there now he turns to Aristotle. We'll turn to Aristotle's ethics, first of all, as the plan, as the model for the arrangement of sins. And then also, we shall see in a very interesting way, he will allude to his physics. So you see, he goes on talking about from a personal problem, which we have to understand in Canto 9, the crisis of then the questions of the intellect and its relationship to the will, and then in Canto 11, this idea of what are the dispositions to sinfulness, and we shall see, and the turn to Aristotle. So let me go back to now looking at exactly the crisis of Canto and Canto 9. Dante is progressing in this journey. He reaches the gate of Dis, and this is around lines 40 and following. Three Furies, the so-called three Erinnys of Greek mythology, Alecto, Tisiphone, and Megara, or Megera. They appear and they stop him. Says, you cannot go into the city. A city described very much as a medieval city. In fact, it's near a kind of swamp for reasons that we have nothing to do with really ecology, but the idea that medieval cities were built near swamps because the land was always more malleable and there was water clearly that's not the reason for Dante, but the reason for the certain ways of understanding medieval cities. The three Furies, Alecto, Tisiphone, and Megara, will stop, and they call on Medusa, who doesn't come, but they summon Medusa. That's why they say, let Medusa come. They threaten the pilgrim with the sight of the Medusa. Let Medusa come. She isn't here, I repeat. This is, if you had to translate it into let's say, from English into Italian, you would use a subjunctive. May she come. I wish she came. We wish she came. Let her come, and we will turn him to stone. That's the threat, a threat of petrification. Because according to the myth, and if you don't know Ovid, for instance, you may have seen a movie about the Medusa. If you gaze at the face of the Medusa, one who gazes at the head of the Medusa, who was a great virginal beauty, a vestal in the temple of Neptune, according to the myth, was violated by Neptune, and Minerva takes revenge on her by metamorphosing her into this ugly, repulsive figure with the hair turned into snakes. And yet she has this power, this magic power, of turning all the onlookers into stone. So that's the threat. Let Medusa come, and we will turn him to stone, they all cried, looking down. We avenged ill the assault of Theseus. Theseus, who also violated the boundaries of hell to free the Eritus, another little story where Theseus was successful in the liberation of Eritus. The drama involving the pilgrim directly, this is a menace on him. Turn thy back, this is Virgil who intervenes, and keep thine eyes shut. For should the Gorgon, the Medusa, show herself, and thou see her, there would be no returning above. And now, that's the turn. Listen to this. My master said this, and himself turned me around, and, not trusting to my hands, covered my face with his own also. The poet interrupts the narrative and talks to us as a poet. This is the first so-called address to the reader. I will talk about this little technical detail. That is to say, this is no longer part of the action. Now it's no longer the pilgrim, the story of the pilgrim, but the poet who is sitting in his study and who says, you who are of good understanding, the Italian says, you who have healthy intellects, you who are of good understanding, note the teaching that is hidden under the veil of the strange lines. The poet, assuming authority, turns to us readers, and in a sense he needs readers so that his authority can be constituted, and he warns us, he admonishes us to engage in what clearly appears as an allegorical operation. We have to read, and the language is the language of allegory, we have to know how to read underneath the veil, the language. There's something hidden underneath this. What is the allegory about? So let me just give you more about the story of the myth of the Medusa, so you will see the relevance maybe of that myth and what I left out of the myth to this scene. Now, as you know, the Medusa will be conquered, will be defeated, right? She will be defeated by the poet, by Perseus, who, and it's the origin of Pegasus, the horse of poetry. Perseus, who, using the shield of Minerva, the shield that Minerva had given him, and by looking not at Medusa directly, at her face directly, but at the reflected image in this shield, in the mirror of the shield of Minerva, manages to see her and will kill, it will slay the Medusa, okay? In the story, within the Ovidian narrative, this is clearly meant to evoke for us the need for a kind of, not a direct vision, but a mediated vision. That is to say, through the mediation of poetry for us, through the mediation of, I'll come back to the scene in a moment, but through the mediation of the shield, can Perseus really take flight, kill, and then take flight on the back of Pegasus. For us, the shield of Minerva is the text, because at this point, you see, there is a sort of direct, let's say, divergence between what the pilgrim is enjoined to do. Virgil says to him, don't look, shut your eyes, and not trusting the pilgrim, either his quickness, he must have been awed by what the situation he doesn't understand. Virgil covers the pilgrim's own eyes. In turn, the poet addresses us and tells us to open our eyes. You open our eyes and look. You can, because you have the shield of Minerva. You have this textual mediation that will allow you to escape the direct threat and glance of Medusa. So we do know that the story, Mercury, who is the messenger, clearly the figure of the interpreter, that's what the messenger means, the bearer of messages, the bearer of words. He comes and manages to make a breach within the wall of the city, and the pilgrim and the guide can continue their descent. This is really the story. So what is happening? How do I have to, can we explain? What is this allegory? Let me say a few things so that you can understand the whole technique of allegory. Because whenever you read the Divine Comedy, probably much more than I would ever do, other scholars will tell you that the Divine Comedy is a vision, which it is, and that it's allegorical, which at times it is. And the allegory is supposed to explain everything, that the pilgrim finds himself lost in the woods. That's not the woods. To me, it's a wood. But they say it's a state of sin, in a way. And there he meets three beasts that stand for pride and wrath and whatnot. They are three beasts, and they may stand for other things. The significance of that initial landscape, as you may recall, when we talked about that scene, is not all that clear, and that's part of the problem. That's what I call the land of unlikeness, within which the pilgrim will find himself. The inability to join together signs and their significations, the awareness that there are no signs which are so self-transparent as to be understood or decodified in a particular way. So what is this idea of allegory? Dante here is clearly telling us that there is an allegory at work. You readers of good understanding, of healthy minds, open your eyes and look underneath the veil of the strange verse. First of all, why are they so strange? What's so strange? What is the story? What's going on here? What is allegory, first of all? Allegory, as you know, the word means to speak otherwise. It's a figure very related, but not quite, to enigmas within the manuals, the primers of rhetorical primers from medieval and classical times. Enigmas, irony, say one thing and you mean another. But to say this is to say very little, because Dante has been very thoughtful, has been probing this issue very deeply, and in a couple of places of his works. The letter to Cangrande that he writes, about which I will talk later, it's a letter that he sends as an introduction to the first 10 cantos of Paradise, the Cangrande being the lord of Verona, where Dante had lived for a while. And also in the Banquet, this philosophical text where he explores the idea of how a meaning can be arrived at. How, I have a statement, how can I go on drawing a particular significance, or more than one significance out of a statement? He distinguishes two types of allegory. Let me show you two types of allegory. And there is a so-called allegory of poets and allegory of theologians. How does he distinguish them? How would he ask us to distinguish between them? The allegory of poets is an allegory where the literal English, the literal sense, is a fable, is a fiction. To say, that's the example he gives, Orpheus, but the power of his language moved stones. That's an allegory of poets. It really means that the power of the voice of the poet manages maybe to edify cities. Whether we need poetic myths for the edification of a city. No, that's understandable. Or to say Orpheus, that by the power of his words tamed lions, it's to say that whatever ferociousness we may have inside us can partly be tamed by the music, the song, the poetry, and so on. That's the allegory of poets. The literal sense is a fiction. To say that it's an allegory of theologian is completely different. And the example that Dante gives is sends us to Exodus, the biblical story of Exodus. You all know, I take, what the biblical story, once again, movies help. The biblical story of Exodus, the story where the Jews abandon, leave the bondage, the slavery of Egypt, go through the desert, and reach the promised land. This is happening historically true. This is not a fiction. This is the Red Sea did open up, and the Jews could pass through the Red Sea, could cross the Red Sea that way. This is history. And in the allegory of theologians, the literal level must be historical, must be an event. Okay? So this is the distinction. Of course, the question is, what kind of allegory is he using here? But we'll come to that in a moment, but keep that in mind. This is, I hope it's more than of archaeological interest. Within the allegory of theologians, they distinguish 4 levels of exegesis. Exegesis being a word meaning of interpretation. 4 levels: the literal, the moral. They say an allegory is telling you what to do, teaching you. It has an ethics involved. You read, and there is an ethics when you are reading. You have more or less a text is trying to direct your will or tell you what you should be doing. A topological, telling you what topological meaning. What does it mean in terms of your whole life, not just an action in a particular case. And then the so-called anagogic or eschatological, so that the story of the Jews crossing the wilderness and going to the Jerusalem means having a kind of spiritual conversion, moral conversion, means that this is really the way life ought to go, that you go from sin to glory or the peace of the city, and then anagogically, this is the story of the soul. It prefigures what the soul ought to do. In the case of the allegory of poets, you only have 2 levels, the literal and the moral. There are a lot of difficulties with this way of distinguishing between the 2 types of allegory, because both allegory of theologians and allegory of poets, even if the allegory of theologians refers to events, they are still words that we are reading. So there's a way in which Dante seems to, at one point, dodge the whole thing of how can you really distinguish between the 2 modes, the 2 rhetorical modes, independently, one from the other. And actually, he goes on saying, really the difference is in how you take the literal sense, in the kind of act of faith that you may have, that the literal sense, that the Bible is the Word of God, then you are reading it theologically. But if you decide, and one might, to say that the Bible is really a collection of extraordinary poetic stories, then you are reading according to the allegory of poets. How is Dante circumventing this whole issue? He's circumventing the whole issue by saying, my story may well be taken as a story of allegory of poets, but it's also an allegory of theologians, because the literal sense is I. The historical sense is in me. I am the historical cipher moving through these experiences, and therefore it is my life that they will give a particular sense, a particular truth value to whatever poetic fable I may be relating. We only have taken care of one little problem here, only very external to the story, the allegory of poets or allegory of theologians. Trying to decide that this is what is going on here. But how are we to understand this threat of petrification? And you cannot really understand it, but I'm here to tell you. You cannot really understand it on your own. So now you have to trust my words. The fact is that Dante had written in his youth a number of poems for a so-called Lady Stone. In Italian, it's not as bad as that, although stone could be a good word. It was just Donna Petra. Petra meaning stone. And the passion, it's a description of a love that was unrequited, but the passion for this woman was such that he felt that his intellect would be petrified, that he could be, in other words, he was unable to go anywhere. It's a statement of despair, if you wish. You know, whenever you have this sense of a death that is going to take over, and you are going to be paralyzed in your will, then this is a petrification. This is what I think is happening here. Dante is engaged in a retrospection to an experience of his past, and that experience of his past is now ahead of him, threatening him once again. He has to cleanse himself, to move beyond it. But to explain better this idea of the closing the eyes, it's why Medusa, though he talks of Medusa there, and this Lady Petra is a kind of Medusa. Let me read a little scene from that I think really explains what's going on and prepares us to move forward to the next canto, Canto 10. It's a little scene from the Confessions of Augustine. As you know, a book that Dante knew very well. Dante even goes on quoting it at very strategic places. So there is not an issue of bringing it in gratuitously to explain, because there is some explain this scene. It's actually direct. It could be viewed. Forgive the reversal. This could be viewed as a gloss on what Dante will go on writing. The Confession is written with. It's an intellectual autobiography. The story of a young man who will go on being fascinated by various schools of philosophy. He's a Manichaean, then he will turn into a Neoplatonist, goes on, is very flattered by a skeptical, rhetorical way. He's a professor of rhetorical way of dealing with values and the world around him. And then in book 9, he'll go on telling the story in the Garden of Milan, the famous story under the fig tree. Very emblematic. We could talk about these things, about why the fig tree in Milan, which leads many scholars to go on wondering, were there fig trees in Milan? Isn't it the climate too cold? You need really the southern climes for that kind of thing. Forgetting that the fig tree is always in the Bible appears as the tree under which the prophets go and rest, in the mistaken belief that everything is over and that somehow the time for complacency may come. They are denouncing it, of course. This is all done in the mode of a denunciation. And that's exactly where Augustine puts himself. I'm under the fig tree, and there he goes on experiencing a particular drama by the reading of St. Paul, etc. Throughout this text, so this is about Neoplatonists and Manichaeans, as you know, Augustine, as you probably know, Augustine goes on reflecting about his love of shows. The biggest one of them at the beginning of book 3 is his love of theater and his critique of the theater. Now, why do I go to the theater, and how do I explain the fact that there may be some well-meaning young man who sees the maiden in distress and jumps on the scene to free her, and goes on talking about how can I be a spectator? What does it mean to be a spectator? What does it mean to be involved? And then there is another little scene. A friend of his, Alypius. Alypius is a Greek intellectual in the best sense of the word, a man who believes in self-mastery, in intellectual self-mastery, a young man who witnesses Augustine's own experiences. You know, in narratives you always have Sancho accompanying Don Quixote. There's always the other, the more or less skeptical, who gives authenticity and who exactly will go on making claims for the truth value of what the narrator or the protagonist will go on experiencing. His name is Alypius. Alypius will eventually rejoin. He's in Carthage. They grew up together. Augustine and he grew up together. Augustine goes to Rome. Alypius will rejoin him in Rome, and they go on from there, eventually go to Milan. When in Rome, Alypius does what normally we would all do. The first thing he wants to do is to go and watch the games played at the amphitheater, the Colosseum. And the games are horrifying games to Augustine. He says, how can an intellectual such as you want to go to the games where actually human beings are being thrown for the delight of the crowds, are being thrown to beasts, to lions? Alypius, of course, he tries to justify himself, but I really want to go, but, you know, exactly because, he'll say, but I'll read it to you because I'll read you the whole passage. I will go, but because I'm an intellectual, I promise that at the crucial moment when the sign is given for the animal to devour the human being lying there, I will not watch. I'm going to turn my eyes away, and I will shut my eyes. Let's see what happens. This is from Book 6, Chapter 8. It's a great little story that, by the way, a scholar of Romance philology who used to teach here many years ago by the name of Erich Auerbach, a great Dante scholar, and he wrote this book called Mimesis. He reflects on this scene, not connecting it with Dante, but it doesn't matter. I read it first in his book, and says this is really, it's a little scene that marks the end of Hellenic rationalism. Let's read this. It's interesting just because of that. Then we'll see how we could apply it to Dante. I think it's very clear. He had gone to Rome to study law. This is Alypius. And there he was carried away incredibly with an incredible eagerness after the shows of gladiators. Okay? For being utterly averse to and detesting such spectacles, he was one day, by chance, met by divers of his acquaintances and fellow students, coming from dinner, and they, with a familiar violence, hailed him, vehemently refusing and resisting into the amphitheater during these cruel and deadly shows. He thus protesting, "Though you hail my body to that place," this is Alypius, "and there set me, can you force me also to turn my mind on all my eyes to those shows? I shall then be absent while present, and so shall overcome both you and them." They, hearing this, led him on, nevertheless, desirous perchance to try that very thing, whether he could do as he said. When they were come thither, and had taken their places, as they could, the whole place kindled with that savage pastime. But he, Alypius, closing the passage of his eyes, forbade his mind to range abroad of such evil. And would he had stopped his ears also, for in the fight, when one fell, a mighty cry of the whole people striking him strongly, overcome by curiosity, and as if prepared to despise and be superior to it, whatsoever it were, even when seen, he opened his eyes, and was stricken with a deeper wound in his soul than the other whom he desired to behold was in his body. And he fell more miserably than he upon whose fall that mighty noise was raised, which entered through his ears and unlocked his eyes to make way for the striking and beating down of a soul. Bold rather than resolute, and the weaker in that had presumed on itself which ought to have relied on thee. For so soon the whole confession is addressed to God. So it's a confession, a witnessing to God. So in case you are confused about the references. For so soon as he saw that blood, he therewith drunk down savageness, not turned away, but fixed his eye, drinking in frenzy, unawares, and was delighted with that guilty fight, and intoxicated with bloody pastime. Nor was he now the man he came, but one of the throng he came unto, a true associate of theirs that brought him thither. Why say more? He beheld, shouted, kindled, carried thence with him the madness which should goad him to return not only with them who first drew him thither, but also before them, and to join others. Yet thence didst thou with a most strong and most merciful hand pluck him, and taught him to have confidence not in himself, but in thee. But this was after, and that's really the story. What is the meaning of the story in the Confessions? I think that Augustine is very clear. The failure of the mind to master its own will. It's about the crisis. It's about the weakness of the will, to begin with, but it's also the pride, the belief that one can rise above the, let's say, the contingency of temptations and be in control of oneself, and yet it's a story of a temptation which he, Alypius, cannot quite resist. I think that this is exactly what's happening in Canto 9. Dante is dramatizing not only the failure of the intellect, he's already been talking about the early part of the canto, the failure of Virgil to guide him. He's discussing now the failure of his will, at least seen as an event of the past, but clearly seen as something that can happen to him again. the passage to the city can take place after this scene. And now he enters into the city of this, and against the walls of the city, he finds the Epicureans. Again, those who do not believe in the immortality of the soul. Let me just read in Canto 10 some passages. By the way, each Canto 10 of the Divine Comedy, they really are all cantos intimately related with each other. So if you were looking for a paper you want to connect Canto 10 of Inferno, Canto 10 of Purgatorio, and Canto 10 of Paradise, I would encourage you to do so. So let me just read a few lines. Dante asks who these souls are, and the answer he gets, this is line 12, all will be shut in when they return from Jehoshaphat, which is the valley in Jerusalem, down in the valley of Jerusalem, where according to the law, the resurrection of the resurrection of the dead will take place. That's where they would be meeting. It's interesting then that there is this contrast in the canto between the so-called Epicureans, who do not believe in the immortality of the soul, and clearly this view, this opposition, as one could call it, between Athens, it's very classical, Athens and Jerusalem. You may have heard of this. The city of Athens, by the way, the word itself means immortality, the immortality of thanatos, the immortality of wisdom. That wisdom survives, but not the people. So there is a kind of contrast between the two cities, very old, very ancient contrast. And now we have in this part Epicurus and all his followers, what we call the Epicureans. Let me just gloss the Epicureans a little bit further than I did before. There are two types in the mythography of the Epicureans. There are two types of Epicureans. Whenever we think about the Epicureans, we think about those, the vulgar Epicureans, those who think about and worship their stomach, the pleasures of food, an Epicurean in that sense. I think that Dante has dramatized that kind of Epicurean in Canto 6 when he meets, remember, Jacko, whose name means pig. In fact, we talk about the hogs of Epicurus, the herd of Epicurus. But then there is the noble version of the Epicureans, here in Canto 10, those who are interested in intellectual pleasures, the pleasures of conversations, the pleasures of friendship, the pleasures of meditation. And there are those who do not, who remove themselves to the garden, do not seem to really care much about what happens around them, because in the belief that they should really cultivate their soul and cultivate their own pursuits, take care of their own pursuits. That's what we are having here. So these are the noble philosophical Epicureans, not the vulgar sort that believe in the supremacy of bodily pleasures. Nonetheless, pleasure is the aim of an Epicurean ethics, my pleasure. Okay, so this continues, and this part Epicurus and all his followers, who made the soul die with the body, have the burial place. How fitting is the punishment for this crime, this sin. It's perfect, because these people never really believed in the immortality of the soul, and they are condemned to be dead. That's what they think, and they dwell literally in sarcophagi, in tombs. That's how they appear. So there is another little detail I have been giving you. Sometimes we may wonder about the appropriateness of a sin, of a punishment for a particular sin, but here we have no reason to really be surprised at all by this kind of destiny reserved for the Epicureans. But for that question to me, thou shalt soon have satisfaction from within, and for the desire too about which thou art silent. And then they're interrupted. All of a sudden. Now Dante is once again involved, and what's here primary is no longer the question of immortality of souls, but how the political aspect, the political implications of this kind of belief, the political implications of this sort of belief. not believing in the mortality of the soul, how is this refracted onto the political scene, as it were? And again, therefore, this is almost a Platonic conceit, the relationship now between no longer body and city, as we saw in Inferno 6, but here soul and city. Is this a soulless city? What happens? How do we experience? How livable, which is, obviously, I mean, it is also a pun, how livable is this kind of city? What happens? What are the relationship? What is the relationship between various figures? Because what Dante singles out are two people, one a Guelph and one a Ghibelline. We are in the middle of the civil war of Florence once again. It's going to be Farinata, a Ghibelline, and Cavalcanti, the father, the old man, who is a Guelph. By the way, they're also related to each other, because Cavalcanti's son, Dante's best friend, you remember he dedicates his Vita Nuova to him. He calls him my first friend. Guido Cavalcanti had married the daughter of Farinata. They stand there in their tombs, ignoring each other, and each ignoring the pangs, worries, perplexities of the other. It's a little picture of what we would call any city. This is the city in the beyond, where everybody's squabbling, nobody's paying attention to anybody else, and everybody believes that one's own passion, one's own concern is really paramount and foremost. There's nothing that can come near to it. So it's a canto that, interestingly enough, is marked by interruptions. One is speaking, the other one says, forget it, I gotta talk now, it's my turn. And so it is a little vignette of Florence in the year 1300, probably, or later, but 1300 is a good date for us. So he's interrupted, Virgil and Dante are interrupted by someone who says, O Tuscan, who makes thy way alive through the city of fire and speaks so modestly, may it please thee to stop at this point. Thy tongue shows the native and noble fatherland to which I was, perhaps, I like that, perhaps, too harsh. Suddenly this sound issued from one of the chests and so on. So they go on, turn around, what ails thee, says Virgil, see there Farinata, who has risen erect from the middle up, thou shalt see his full height. He appears from the navel up in the tomb. And now a little historical detail. There used to be, in Rome, the church is still there, but it was already there in the year 1300 when Dante went on an embassy to Rome, the church so-called of the Holy Cross in Jerusalem, which according to the legend was built with material, with stones from Jerusalem that had been brought to Rome by Constantine's mother, Helena. In the basement of that church, which would be opened only once a year around the Easter season, there would be a mosaic showing, and you can say it would only on Good Friday that basement would be open. And that mosaic, it's no longer there. It's no longer there. So I'm not encouraging tourism. It's just I'm giving you a little detail. There used to be a mosaic of the rising Christ shown from the navel up. And it's clear here that the representation of Farinata showing himself from the navel up is meant as a caricature of the belief in the resurrection. There are two. This is really the story of a man who doesn't believe in the resurrection. And iconographically, Dante will go on in focusing, insisting on this, on the counter. This man doesn't believe in the resurrection. There is another possibility of looking at it, so that there is the description is deliberate. It's clearly meant to evoke all of that. So there is a great exchange between them, who defeated whom, the continuous battles between Guelphs and Ghibellines, and Dante claims that his own family managed to take good revenge when the time came, and clearly the implication is that more revenge, since Dante has been, will be necessary. They're interrupted by the sight of by the old man Cavalcanti. So look at what the what the story of the canto is. Farinata worries about his ancestors. Cavalcanti worries about his son. So these are Epicureans who have a sense of continuity somehow, sense of dynastic continuity, or within the immanence of personal concerns and family. So they move beyond the fragmentations of self from the others. They seem to have a kind of extended idea of themselves in spite of themselves, in spite of their beliefs. This is what happens, an extraordinary scene. Then rose to sight, line 55 and following. Beside him a shade, showing as far as the chin. I think he had lifted himself on his knees. He looked around about me as if he had the desire to see whether someone was with me. But when his expectation was all quenched, he said, weeping, if thou goest through this blind prison by height of genius, where is my son? And why is he not with thee? The reference clearly is to Dante's best friend, to Guido, whose name also means that he should be guiding him. Maybe the old man, the old father, was hoping that the son, according to his name, could really be leading the younger poet, as he had led him in his early poetic experiments in Florence. And then he answers, he's disappointed, and Dante answers, I answered him, I come not of myself. He, doesn't even mention him, meaning Virgil, he that waits yonder is leading me. So this is the pun on Guido, through here, perhaps to, that's very unclear. The text here, my translation is to her, and so does yours, but many other translations probably will say something different. I would say to one, your Guido held in disdain. It's unclear, because the her would mean he's leading me. Virgil leads me to Beatrice, whom Guido held in disdain. Why would Guido hold Beatrice in disdain? Is this really the story of the Vita Nuova, the antagonism between Guido and Beatrice? There's nothing that really suggests all of that. To one would be to God, or to some aim that Guido held in disdain. We'll see what that means. His words and the nature of his punishment had already told me his name, so that I replied thus fully. Suddenly erect, he cried, how saidst thou? He held. That's Dante uses the past preterite, he held. The old man infers, because they use the past preterites, that his son is already dead. A mistake, an equivocation. He held, lives he not still? Strikes not a sweet light on his eyes. When he perceived that I made some delay before replying, he fell back again and was seen no more. But Farinata is unconcerned. He goes on saying, well, yeah, you drove us back, but we drove you back. Brings the subject to the political, strictly to the war between Welfs and Ghibellines. So that we really have to ask, Dante goes on and says, please, before leaving, reassure the old man that his son is still alive. Because by the year of the journey, Guido was supposed to be alive, though he will die very quickly afterwards. What is this story of political disarray of Florence and the story of the memory of Dante's friend, with whom he had just, the friendship had finished. The friendship was over. Dante, for those of you who are interested in the biography of the poet, one of the early and toughest decisions he had to make was to banish Guido Cavalcanti from the city, because he thought that Guido was the cause of some unrest within the city. Guido went into exile and never made it back. He died 3 months later in the swamps of Liguria, a little bit north of Tuscany. And so that Dante lives in many ways with a kind of guilt, personal guilt. I suppose he won't talk about it openly, about what had been happening between them. So how are we to understand this scene? Let me just give you some some other details about this canto. If you go through this blind prison by height of genius, there's a little bit of irony there. Cavalcanti clearly does not understand, nor can he understand, that Dante's journey in the beyond is not due to height of genius. But these are the philosophers, and he has a kind of philosophical idea about how certain experiences are going to be possible. Why is not my son with you? I said, I come not of myself, he that to one whom your Guido held in disdain. What has happened here? Who is Guido, really? Guido is what we call an Averroist. Did you ever hear the term Averroist? Probably not. Averroes, Dante actually mentions him in Limbo, was an Arab philosopher and the famous commentator of Aristotle. And of all the texts, he commented, just as now, in the Middle Ages, they would be reading the great classics of philosophy, especially very, very difficult texts such as the On the Soul of Aristotle, following the commentators. Averroes was known as the great commentator. He was the great commentator of Aristotle's On the Soul. And he argues that Aristotle does not believe in the immortality of the soul. That's the argument. He's going to be challenged by Aquinas and by many others, but that's the primary. Guido Cavalcanti follows Averroes' understanding about the soul. So that the one who is here a heretic, so to speak, is not just the old man, but also Guido Cavalcanti himself. Now, at this point, before I go any further, telling you more about who is an Averroist, and what does it mean to be an Averroist, I really have to raise a point with you. What does heresy mean? Because I did indicate that in antiquity, it was never really thought of as a sin, because it's a question of mind. The word comes from the Greek, airesis, meaning to choose. One who is a heretic, is someone who makes a particular intellectual choice. And to be viewed as a sinner, you have to also indicate some kind of an element of pride behind a particular belief. And so Guido is held responsible for disseminating this idea of Averroism. What is then Averroism? Well, one of the ideas that Averroes has is that we, in the commentary on the soul, that we human beings are not even capable, intrinsically capable of thinking. That we are made, remember the famous structure, the diagram about the soul, that we are concupiscent entities and sensitive entities. We are also rational entities, but rationality occurs to us intermittently. Thoughts, we even say that in English, a thought came to me. That reminds me the best way of understanding Averroism. We don't think all the time. Occasionally thought comes to us, and there's no way that really, and when we think, we are really in existence, a sort of break, discontinuity from the world of feeling. So there's a fairly tragic understanding, making human beings the object of thoughts, not subjects of thoughts. We are not agents capable of producing thoughts. Thoughts come to us. And also tragic because it sort of presents a break between the sensitive part of our experiences and the rational part of our experiences. We live like animals more often than not. We eat, we drink, we sleep, and so on. Then occasionally we manage to disengage ourselves from all of this and capable of contemplative thoughts. At that point, we no longer really live. We are abstracted from ourselves. We are removed from ourselves. Not only we don't believe in these ideas shape one of the most beautiful poems written at the time of Dante by Guido Cavalcanti himself, and the poem is called A Lady Asks Me. I want to tell you what the poem is about. It's a poem where there's a fiction. The poet Guido Cavalcanti imagines that a woman, which may have been the case, asks him to define love. He says, you poets are always talking about love, and I don't understand what you mean by love, and nor do I understand what the effects of love. And he writes this song, this long song, saying that love, a lady asked me to talk about the nature of love, the function of love, and the effects of love. And he goes on almost scholastically, taking one case after the other. He begins by saying, in the exposition, that love is a passion that comes from Mars, not from Venus. That is to say, the nature of love is always to be one of conflict and one of war and chaos, not one of an order, the benevolent Venus. He goes on to saying that it induces death, and it's characterized by deliriums of the mind. It's a very clearly grim idea of love. What Dante is doing in this Canto 10 is connecting with those ideas of love and the politics of civil war. He finds that there is a strict necessary connection and a necessary correlation between the thinking about love of Guido Cavalcanti, whom Dante opposes, as you know from the Vita Nuova, where he believes that Beatrice can indeed be someone who can lead him to God and to the knowledge of God, in the persuasion that it is not by truth that you come to the knowledge of God. If you cannot come to the knowledge of God by truth, then how do you come to the knowledge of God? By love, by thinking about love. That's the way of the ascent. And on the other hand, Dante will have this idea that that the political, that the order of civil, that the disorder, civil disorder, the civil war is nothing else than the phenomenon of a theory put forth by the Averroists and by Guido Cavalcanti. So this is really what I think the double focus of this canto: love and politics, and the connection between them. A connection which by the way, the Averroists and and whom Dante links with the Epicureans, deny. But he's making this connection, imaginatively a connection, denied by the philosophers themselves. With Canto 11, and Dante will go on, we'll have a few minutes and I can talk about this. Dante, as I said, explains the order of, on the face of it, the juxtaposition is clear. To the disorder of the city, we are now going to have a reflection, a rational reflection on the order that sustains the city of hell. If there is any disordered place, it is as if there is a logic even to the disorder of evil. And the idea is that there's a tripartite division to hell, the plan of hell. All the sins are divided into three parts. Sins of incontinence that we saw from Canto 3, 4, 5 actually, to Canto 9. The middle area, which is called the area of violence, and then the third area, the sins of fraud. And Dante calls fraud the sin peculiar to human beings, because it's not just a sin of the will, but there is also the premeditation of the mind, the complicity of the mind. The sins of fraud, which are also sins of treachery. Dante sees the conjunction of will and at the same time the order of reason in the performance of that evil. And the canto comes to ends with a question. Dante says that this is all from the Ethics of Aristotle, and then Dante wonders, look, here say, you, lines 90, O sun, that healest all troubled sight, so dost thou satisfy me with the resolving of my doubts, that it is no less grateful to me to question than to know. Turn back again a little, I said, to the point, I've been explaining everything. Actually, he didn't explain everything. He never explained heresy, which we took some time to talk about, and he never really explains, Dante tells you never really say anything about usury. The point that the usury offends against the divine goodness, and lose that not. Why is usury? What is usury exactly? And the question is, why does Dante ask this question of usury? How does he answer it? Because we can understand why he asks about it. How does he answer what usury is? And let me just read this passage, lines 98 and following. Philosophy, for one who understands, he said to me, notes, not in one place only, how nature takes her course from the divine mind and its art. If thou note well thy physics, another text of Aristotle. Now, the ethics is mentioned first, now the physics. Thou will find, not many pages on, that your art, as far as it can, follows nature as the pupil, the master, so that your art is to God, as it were, a grandchild. By this too, if you recall to mind Genesis, near the beginning, the biblical book of Genesis, it behooves mankind to gain their livelihood and their advancement. And because the usurer takes another way, he despises nature, both in herself and in her follower, setting his hope elsewhere. But now follow me, for I would go. The fishes are quivering on the horizon, and all the wane lies overcover us, and farther on there is the descent of the cloud. To explain the sin of usury, Dante puts forth a theory of art. That's what's happening. As if usury were a violation of art. How does he understand art? Art, what is art? He understands art as work. That's the best way to explain it, right? Talking about the beginning of Genesis, when when Adam was thrown out of the Garden of Eden and was told that in order to retrieve the garden, he had to go to work. That work becomes an ascetic, not a punishment. Here Dante doesn't see work as a punishment, but an ascetic exercise whereby one can regain or transform the wilderness into paradise. That's really the idea, but I think there is more that is happening here in this connection. But this is the general thrust of the canto. What is art in the Middle Ages? You may want to know, because first of all, I did say that there is a general coherence. You remember those were my initial words when I started today's class, from Canto 9 to Canto 11. Art is understood by the scholastics as a virtue of the practical intellect, in the order of making, a virtue of the practical intellect. And you may wonder, what is this practical intellect? How many intellects do we have? Well, there's a speculative intellect. When Dante talks about the immortality of the soul, and those who do not believe in the immortality of the soul, that's a question of the speculative intellect. If I went on thinking about God, suppose that I had this weakness of mine to think about justice, for instance, an abstract idea of justice, not particular cases of justice, then I'm involved in an exercise of the speculative intellect. He ends the canto with the practical intellect. An emphasis on the practical intellect is the mind that worries about doing or making, and they are not the same thing. What is the difference? To say that there is a practical intellect in the order of doing would be to worry about, when you talk about prudence, a virtue of doing, because it's not the artisan's work. To say that it's a virtue of the practical intellect in the order of making, it means that the work of art is a thing that one elaborates. From this point of view, the issue is never really one of does it tell the truth about whatever. It has its own thinkness. It's a thing. The work of art is something made, and therefore, as made, it has its own reality, it has its own laws, it has its own rigor. That's one thing. So it's work, but look at all the images that Dante is using to reflect on this problem. Philosophy, for one who understands, he said to me, notes, not in one place only, how nature takes a course from the divine mind and its art. And if thou note well thy physics, which is it's a theory of nature, really. It's a theory of motion. It's a theory of how things grow, how things are born, grow, and perish, right? Thou will find, not many pages on, that your art, as far as it can, follows nature as the pupil, the master, so that your art is to God, as it were, a grandchild. I just want to talk about these metaphors here to make you understand how Dante understands art. On the face of it, he's saying that art must be an imitation of nature, right? You have follow nature. So does Dante then have a mimetic idea of art? Not at all. Not at all. Because look at the metaphors he's using, two metaphors. Your art, as far as it can, follows nature as the pupil, the master, so that your art is to God, as it were, a grandchild. Because art follows nature. Nature is the child of God, so art is a grandchild. But it's an image of fecundity and fertility. You can understand why Dante opposes art, finally, to usury. Usury is viewed as the activity that is sterile, an activity that produces what's symbolic, money out of money. So it's a symbolic kind of operation. As opposed to it, Dante casts the virtue of art as work, but one of production, one of generation, the grandchild of God. Art is the grandchild of God. And then there is this other metaphor, as the pupil follows the master, which is not a gratuitous metaphor, because after all, within the context, here Dante has Virgil who is teaching him. So there's also almost a kind of flattery, if you wish. One little detail, he's flattering the relationship. He acknowledges his discipleship to Virgil, which he does all the time, but it implies the educational aspect of art. In the most etymological sense of the term, art educates in the sense that it leads us out of a particular state of, call it barbarity, ignorance, darkness, etc. So it has an educational and non-mimetic role, because art imitates the productive rhythms of the natural world. Dante views an art that is open to beginnings, to life. This is the main meaning of Genesis, the idea of Genesis. An art that is original, but not in a romantic sense of originality, but an art that leads us back to the thought of origins, the thought of how things come into being, because only then do we understand what the ends are. To understand the ends, we've got to know something about the beginnings, about the seeds that make us whatever it is that we think we are. So we have gone then from Canto 9 to Canto 11, from concerns about the pride of the mind, which we could even call the wound of the intellect, and the weakness of the will, to the view that really is no distinction between an Epicurean thinking about oneself and the state, and distinct from some kind of theorizing. Dante sees connection between them, to finally an idea of art. And I think that this idea of art is also for Dante remedial for the evils to which we are prone. Dante thinks that should we apply to ourselves the same kind of care and rigor with which an artist produces the work of art, then what we call the cultivation of the soul may indeed begin to take place. Okay, so art, Dante's attention to art is part of this ascetic exercise. Let me finish here, because that will give a few minutes as I touch on a number of issues, and I'm anxious to hear your perplexities, questions, comments, suggestions, whatever. Yes?
With the heretics, he makes it so clear that they sin because it's both intellect and will. It's because
you have.
With the heretics, he
Yes.
makes it clear that they sin both because of intellect and will. It's not just because they're thinking something false.
The question is, with the heretics, that we are not really dealing only with the question of thought, or it's a freedom of thought, but it deals with the fact that the heretics are engaged in acts of intellect which are supported or shaped by also acts of the will. That was exactly what I maintained.
And that makes sense. But then does he ever really try and explain too then? I mean, everyone wonders about the virtuous pagans and why they're there. And it seems that theirs is really just a failure of intellect, and there's really no failure of will for them.
for Dante, you mean? The question is about the pagans. Does Dante think that there is not just the failure, if I understood the question, the failure of the intellect, but also the failure of the will? Yes, I think that this is the case. We shall see a number of pagans where probably we can see highlighted some of these concerns that he has. Concerns. You will read Ulysses, who is represented as engaged in a flight of the mind, the wings of the intellect. You know, they are wings of desire, Platonic wings of desire. And then Francesca, Canto 5, you know, remember she says, like a dove, etc., called by desire, the open wings, clearly, the wings of desire. And then in the case of Ulysses, you're going to have the wings of the intellect, the mind that tries to reach, the flight of the mind. But he too appears as a rhetorician. That is to say, it would seem that we like to believe that there is a distinction between, let's say, a metaphysical, since it's talking about physics, as a kind of metaphysical, intellectual flight. And Dante is always saying, look, trying to always probe the presence of passions, the rhetorical aspect of the claims to reach the truth, or the plane of truth. Yes. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, it's also just, you know, they were put there because Christ hadn't come yet, which is why they were still in hell. Why Virgil can't go to heaven, right? I'm just wondering, is that like
Okay.
Good.
Then I have been missing the mark in answering, and the question really is, how are the pagans in hell because Christ had not yet come, and in what way did they violate?
That just seems a failure of intellect rather than...
The failure of intellect? No. The answer is no. And let me give you a general idea why it's no, and then a particular idea. First of all, generally, if Dante were to judge, and he does, judge the world, the culture of, let's say, Greek, the classical world, he puts most of it in limbo. That's a judgment. And, you know, you're really marginal. You're really liminal to my story. That's what he's saying. Though in paradise he will go out of the way to reclaim Plato, Aristotle, and all the possible Aristotelians. If he were to do that from a perspective which is outside, you know, he really would be a boring poet, in my view. You know, you don't believe in the immortality of the soul, as if he were saying to Epicurus, I do, you're a fool, and therefore I'm saved, and I put you in hell. That's really not worthy of a great mind, because one can imagine Epicurus saying, well, you are the fool, and you think you are saved. I know what I have been doing. So you can take such. Dante never does that. What he does do is take the perspective of the sinners themselves, let them talk, and gives them a rope with which they hang themselves. That's really what's happening. That's the best way to present this argument. So he's not judging the pagans. Now I'm coming straight to your question. He's not judging the pagans from a Christian standpoint alone that is outside of it, for a number of reasons. Because he believes, actually, that that the pagans are adumbrations of the Christian view, the Christian vision. They are not just other to be rejected. On the contrary. And then in particular, I can say, that Dante will go on praising some pagans, say, among the saved. He even praises one figure, the so-called Ripheus, who was only mentioned once. And we know nothing about him. A Roman who was a sailor with Aeneas, and only because Virgil refers to him as Justus Ripheus, the just Ripheus, which is, to me, a way by which Dante says, not just the kings, but every simple, humble worker can also be saved. Trajan, the Emperor Trajan, and so on. So there are a number of other cases. In the case of Virgil, I'm not going to go there because I'm going to be on TV for the next 6 months. I don't know how many. Because reams of books have been written by people who wish to see him saved. I mean, such a good guy throughout Inferno and Purgatory, and the people who go on arguing that he may be saved. One thing we know is that he comes as far as the Garden of Eden, and just as about Beatrice is going to arrive, and the pilgrim, the lover now, Dante trembles at the idea that here she is, the destination of his journey, and he needs the help of Virgil. He turns around, and his eyes will never see him again. He had vanished. So we know that. There is a kind, that seems to be the limitation of how far he can go. But to say this is really to say very little, because within Dante's cosmos, Dante has an idea of the curvature of space, okay? That's the sphere. And a redemption means that all things will go back to the beginning. That's what happens. So only from that point of view, we don't have a lot of thematic reflections about this aspect. Who is going to be saved at the end of time? Who knows? The whole question is the unfathomable quality of God's justice. Dante wonders, though. We're talking about Christ, and what about those who are living near the banks of the Hindus? They never heard the name of Christ. Are they going to be saved? And they are just. Can they be condemned? These are questions that he will not answer. He raises these questions in Paradise. So you're a little bit impatient, I say. But I think that from the point of view of eschatology, he must have an idea of, otherwise redemption has failed. If some people are damned, then there is no redemption. You see what I'm saying? In the measure in which evil, if you get into this metaphysical framework, if there is going to be residues of sin, then there is also a residue of injustice. I don't know that I answered your question. I think I did, but yes.
Thinking about the Medusa, I understand the idea of Medusa as an allegory for the mediation of poetry, but is it also a connection between the figure of the woman and the act of petrification? Thinking about the Donna Petra, I'm wondering if Dante is also saying something about the dangers of love or the dangers of misplaced love.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. The question is about the story of the Medusa and the part about the mediation of poetry to conquer Medusa is clear. But the question also wonders whether this has to do with, first of all, the fact that Medusa is a woman, and also that petrification is the petrification of misplaced love. Is that an accurate paraphrase? Okay, and the answer is, that's a great question. I sense there your awareness of the Freudian reading of the myth of the Medusa as castration, as indeed a kind of literalization of the threat, at least not castration, but the threat of castration on the male from the point of view of Medusa. I will take the second part of your remark to explain also the first part. I think that this is a question of misdirected love. But what Dante has seen, I would urge you to go and read the poems about this Lady Petra, the Lady of Stone, because they are poems where Dante literally engages in fantasies of violence against her. If I could get my hands on her, that with a passion unrequited makes him, it's almost a sort of sadistic coloring about it. So I think it's clearly misdirected love. What he understands, though, is the kind of death that sort of desperate love has brought to him. You can view that death as the fear of castration. I think it's an extreme version of that. So I would agree with what I hear is behind your question. Yes.
So why does he draw us into that allegory of Medusa and petrified love?
Well, you mean if it's the question is why does he draw us into that allegory if it's about petrified love, right? This is the question, And I presume, I don't want to explain your question, I have to answer your question, but I presume that your question stems from your kind of concern you have. If it's such a private story, why us? In what way are we involved in that? This is his story, right? And the answer that I could give is, yes, this can be seen as Dante's own confession. And the confession, and that's why I read the passage from Augustine's own confessions, a confession that can also be exemplary to us. And because he thinks, I think, that there are no experiences which are just irreducibly private and therefore unshareable. It's part of the concern of this writer, that anything that will happen to him, I have to say this, we are going to find moments when he tells us his night dreams, pretty heavy night dreams, but treated with extraordinary, I think, care. Like we're going to have this, we're going to enter into his psyche. Why way of entering into the psyche? Because he has to understand not only how shareable are his experiences, but also what is the root of the way we make decisions. Can we really be ever all the time vigilant? This is in the case of the dream. Am I responsible if I perceive the world in a certain way? Am I responsible if dreams come to me in a certain way? Then am I accountable for this kind of dreams? So the concern is always that of trying to delimit an area where there is some common ground between his experiences and ours. And that's the transaction of allegory. Okay? Yes?
At the end of Canto 9, I don't know if it's significant, but Dante turns to the right as he enters the city of Ix. Did you find that significant, just going back to what we talked about last time?
Of course. Okay. This is fantastic. The question is, I have been talking about the fact that in Inferno, Dante goes to the left. Seems to, which I also said, though, that is really very difficult to visualize. So we say counterclockwise or clockwise, that his descent is clockwise in Inferno. And yet, I'm so grateful to you for noticing this. Here in Inferno 9, Dante actually goes out of the way to say that he turned to the right. And I don't have a position of my own on this, but there are those who believe, well, this is to emphasize that heresy is primarily the disease of the intellect. You know, you remember that I specified that there is the will and the intellect, and the will is always the left, and the intellect is the right. I think that Dante is, this is the point where Dante is sleeping. It happened to Homer occasionally to fall asleep, and this is the only time that you have caught him dozing off. Okay, thank you so much.